Hello everybody, welcome to part 3 of this tutorial. In this part, I'll be going over how you can implement Redux in an existing application. So by the end of this tutorial, we'll be having an application like this, where we have a Redux DevTools, and we can view our state, user login state from here. All right, so when the user logs in, for instance, with their email address and password, okay, you can see how we load the user information here with the first name David and last name Huang, and we display the first name here. And that's going to be all done through Redux. So before we do anything, let me explain how Redux works in simple terms. We have the store, we have the action, and the reducer. So we have these three different parts added to the application. So store is just a central place where we combine all the states, and our states reside in here. And then we can call this states directly from any of the components. And then when something happens, when some kind of change happens on click or reload, our action is gonna throw or basically display an action to the reducer, and the reducer is going to recognize what kind of action it is and then return the modified state to the store. Okay, and the store is again going to hold the current states with an updated information and then pass it to the component that wants the current state. And if you want to take a look at this diagram, of course you can pause the video, but that's pretty much all that I'm going to explain for Redux, and it's going to make more sense once we start writing something. The first thing we want to do, of course, we want to install and save Redux. We're also going to have a middleware called Redux Thunk, and then Redux DevTools -extension. Alright, while that's getting installed, that was pretty fast. We're first going to go into index.tsx. And here I want to import provider from React Redux. Okay, that's going to be our new wrapper. Instead of this react.strict mode, I am going to, okay, my bad. Get rid of this react.strict mode. All right, and then wrap everything around in a provider like this. And it's going to ask us to pass in something. So no overload matches is called. In here we have to pass store. Okay, and this is something we're going to create right now. So under the source directory, I want to create this store.tsx. So I'm simply going to type out everything and explain as I go. So I'm going to import a bunch of things from Redux. The first thing I want is create store, also combine reducers, and apply middleware. Also going to import Thunk from Redux Thunk. Also going to import compose with DevTools from Redux DevTools extension. I don't know why I didn't have the auto filling in. Okay, so first I'm going to define reducers using combine reducers. So combine reducers basically combine all the reducers that we have into this single object, which we are going to define later. And then we are also going to define our initial state, which is going to be an empty object for now. And lastly, the most important thing, a store, which we create using create store. And then inside the create store, we are gonna have reducers, initial state, and compose with DevTools, which is going to allow us to interact with the Redux DevTools that I've shown you earlier. And inside here, I'm going to pass in apply middleware. And in here, I can pass in the Redux Thunk. Okay, if you have more than one middleware, we can define middleware and then pass in the Thunk in an array like that. And here, instead of passing in the Thunk itself, I'm gonna use a spread operator to pass everything inside the middleware like that. So this is an alternative, and that's pretty much it as of the basic structure for the store. And the next thing I want to define is an action, a user action basically. So I'm going to create this folder called actions, and then inside here define user action.tsx. So inside user action, we are going to define a function called login, which is going to receive an email and a password. And we receive this from the components, okay, if you remember. So action receives information from the components. So we'll see later how we pass this to the action. But for now, let me just complete this. Okay, and one important thing that might be a little confusing, but it's unique to action, is we call this dispatch function asynchronously. All right, and this is possible thanks to the Redux Thunk that we implemented in the store here. This allows us to call dispatch function asynchronously. Okay, and that's something you can definitely look into. I'm not going to go further into the concept, but for now, I just want to create this simple login function in the action file. And in here, I want to define a try catch statement. Inside, I am simply gonna dispatch a sample action, which is gonna have a type. And as an example, I want to say user login success or something. Okay, and for the type, we want to use constants instead of typing the string value out like that. So again, inside the source folder, I want to create this constants directory, and inside there, user constants, okay, the tsx like that. So I actually already have this defined somewhere else. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this here, and we're gonna export these constants out. So if you want to use that, of course, we would have to import from constants, right? User constants. And for now, I'm just going to import user login success. And that's the only constant we are using as a sample for now. Okay. And that's all we have in the actions. So inside the action, what we can do later, we can fetch data from backend, and then we can pass this data to the reducer in the payload of the dispatch. Okay, we'll see this later, but we're basically going to fetch data and then pass it to the reducer all inside the action. So once we have this basic structure in the action, I want to define reducer. Here I want to create the reducers directory, and inside here I'm going to define the user reducer.tsx. Inside here I want to create this user login reducer function that receives a state and an action. That's what reducers always receive. Okay, and define a switch statement, and based on the action type, for a case where we have user login success, we are going to return a specific state, so a modified state. this is what we are going to be defining here. And as an example, I am going to have this loading state later, which is going to be defined later, but we can pass in something like that. And then, you know, like any new information, we're going to pass in here as a new state. That's an example of our reducer. And before we move on to define the type of the state, etc. in an interface, I want to wrap this part up for the index.tsx. So here, now that we have the store created, we can import store from store.tsx and pass it in here like that. Define from store like that. So that's probably happening in the store because I didn't export it. Default store. Save that, and then save that. So that's all we have to do for index.tsx. We're done for that. Okay, and let's come back to the user reducer. So we want to define the type for the state as well as the action. So on top here, I am first gonna define this interface, call it user state, and I'm exporting this interface because I'm gonna be using this in the pages and everywhere else whenever we call or use the states, or when we have to return the states. So we want to export this interface for uses in other components. So we are going to have 3 different states. The first one is going to be loading state, which is going to be a Boolean type, and I'm going to keep this optional. Same for error string. And we're not really using these states, but I just want to define for the sake of example purposes. And user info is going to be an object that contains an optional first name and optional last name, like that. Okay, we have this user state interface defined, and we're going to specify the type of our state here. Same for action. And we're not going to export it because we don't need this interface from any other component other than this specific component. The type is going to be of string, and payload would be optional, and this would be a string as well. And then we can define the type for this action like that. So while we are still inside the reducer, let's actually complete this part first. So this example I'm going to get rid of. And then for other cases, for let's say user login success, actually my bad, this is going to be a user login request. And this is going to be user login success. We want to return loading to be false. So we're saying we're not loading the page anymore. And we want to pass our user info, which is gonna come inside the payload of the action. So in case you forgot what we have in the payload from the action, we're gonna fetch data from the backend, which is our user info. Okay, and we are passing this user info to the reducer in the payload. So when we dispatch an action, we receive it from the reducer through the action, and then we are returning this specific state. Okay, always you can always refer back to this diagram if anything seems confusing. All right, let's come back to this. And for user login, let's say fail, we're gonna say loading, there's no more loading, but we are also gonna pass in the error, which is gonna come from the payload. And for user logout. We are not gonna return anything, so an empty object. And as a default, we're gonna return the original state without any changes. Okay, I have to import this here, save that. So that's all we are gonna have with the, or for the reducer. Now let's move back to the user action. And inside the user action, let's first define the types. Email is gonna be of type string, same for the password. So the next thing we wanna do is type check our asynchronous dispatch, basically our Redux Thunk. So I have this website, which is an official Redux website. Under usage with Typescript section, it tells you how we can do type checking for Redux Thunks. And of course, you can go over this documentation. I'm going to include this in the description box below. And basically we have the return type of the Thunk function, and then everything else here you can read through. So here, in order to work with the types, I want to import from Redux Thunk a few things. So I'm first gonna import Thunk Action and Thunk Dispatch. And for your information, everything I'm going over here is in the documentation. And I'm also gonna import something from Redux, which is gonna be any action. Like that. And before we move on, there's one thing I want to define in the store, and that is the root state, which we can define like this: type of store dot get state. So root state is basically the type of store dot get state. So it would be the states that we get from these combined reducers. And we are going to define our reducers and the states later here, and I'm going to show you what this is and how this works. But for now, I'm going to define the root state using this statement. Of course, this is from this documentation again. It tells you how to define the type of your root state in the store. Okay, so save that. I'm going to come back to the reducer, to the action. So here, just to make things clearer, let me separate this like that. And this would be a Thunk action. A Thunk action first requires the R part, okay, which is the return type of the Thunk function. And this is gonna be a promise function of type void. And the second one is gonna be root state, which is a state type used by getState. And E is going to be any extra argument injected into the Thunk. And we can keep this unknown. And the last element would be any action. Of course, we have to import the root state from store. Root state from store, like that. Async dispatch, and we also want to define the type of this dispatch, which is going to be a Thunk dispatch. If you look at what Thunk dispatch receives, it's pretty much the same thing as the Thunk action. So in here we have root state, unknown, and any action, like that. And lastly, this is gonna return a promise So that's what we are gonna add and save that. So this is how we would type check our login action function. And now we want to move on to the login screen where everything happens. So if we look at the application that we have built, we are interacting directly with the backend from each of the screens. So from login screen or sign up screen, we are actually fetching data like that. What we want to do is actually get rid of this await fetch here and paste it in our user action. Because like I said, we're fetching data from backend in our action. Okay, save that for now. We're gonna come back to action later. Let's wrap up login screen first. So what's gonna happen when we submit or when we basically log in? We're gonna log in and then submit, which is gonna call this submit handler on submit. This is where we wanna call the dispatch or reference the dispatch function in our action, which is our login function. So in order to reference a dispatch, we can simply do dispatch. Okay, we don't have this defined yet, that's why it's not happening. And then we can dispatch something like this and pass the email and password like that. But in order to be able to do that, inside the login screen, we have to import a few things. So I'm gonna import from React Redux and import use selector and use dispatch. So here I'm gonna define this constant or variable dispatch using the use dispatch hook. And because we don't have this login defined yet, we also have to import login from action / user action. Okay, now this is working. So when the user logs in and calls the submit handler, it's going to dispatch our login function and pass the email and password as its parameter. And there's one very important thing that we want to add in our login screen, but I'm going to come back to this later and show you what that is. And this has to do with the refreshing of the page and keeping the state up to date when we are reloading the page. But I'm going to come back to that later because I want to keep this in order. In our login screen, when the user logs in, again, it's going to call the dispatch function and pass the email and password to dispatch. So now let's go into action and see what we can do here. So from what we used to have inside our screen page, we now fetch data from the backend inside our action. So here I want to define actually store this in a response variable. And then from here, I'm going to extract the data by doing await response.json like that. And I'm going to define an object that's going to follow the format of our state and store the first name from the data as well as the last name. Just for your information, we're doing first underscore name and last underscore name just because of how the data or JSON formatted data is defined in our backend. So it's going to depend on how you actually defined your first and last name in your JSON format. Okay. And this is just for our example. Okay, so we have this user data. And if this fetch was successful, we are going to be able to extract this data and store it in the user data. If this fetch wasn't successful, it's going to throw an error, and then we're going to catch it here, and then we're going to do user login fail. Next thing we want to do is pass this user data to the reducer in the payload. We can do that by calling another dispatch inside here. I'm going to say user login success. And inside the payload, we're going to pass this user data. So if we have reached the end of this line 29, we already know the fetch was successful. So we would store this here and then dispatch that like this. Save that. And while we are in here, let's also define what we have here. So in here, I'm going to dispatch. Type would be user login fail. And then as a payload, I'm going to pass the error dot response. And let me actually just type this out. This is just something I learned from Brad Traversy. And depending on whether we have the error response, we are either going to pass the message itself from the response.data or error message like this. And this is just how our error is going to be formatted. You can just copy and paste this to fit your own needs. So we have defined our actions. We have also defined our reducer. The next thing we want to do is move on to the home screen. So if you remember, we want to display the name of the user once the login was successful. Okay, and if you remember from the diagram, we can retrieve the states from the store using the useSelector hook. So we don't have to receive this first name as a props from app.tsx. Okay, we don't need this anymore. So I'm going to get rid of everything here. Actually, not in the header. In the home screen, I'm going to get rid of this first name props here. Same for the home screen itself. We don't need this props. We don't need this interface. So here I'm going to import useSelector hook from React Redux. I'm also going to need root state that we defined in the store. And we are going to define our state to be user login. And to use the useSelector, we can simply call the state and then specify what we want from the state. For instance, user login or something like this. Okay, and you might be thinking what this user login is, because what we defined back in the reducer, there's no user login. We have user info, but where is this user login coming from? I'll go over that very quickly in a second, but let's define our useSelector first. We have to type check our useSelector as well. Here we want to specify the type of our original state and the return type of our state, which we have to import as well. So I'm going to import user state from reducers slash user reducer, and this is not defined. Okay, so you might be thinking, where is this state coming from? And this is the part that confused me for a while when I first learned about Redux. And that's the thing that's defined in the store under combined reducers. We're going to define user login state. And of course, you can name this however you want, but we are going to link our reducer to this user login state object, or however you want to call it. So here, I'm going to link user login reducer to the user login state, like that. And of course, you can name it however you want. You can say user log or something like that. Okay, once you save that, when we reference a state, that's going to be the available state for us. But we don't want that for now. We want to call it user login. Save that back in home screen. We can refer to that state, user login state.user login. So just for clarification, user login reducer returns a state, if you remember. Okay, let's look at this diagram. Reducer, our user login reducer returns some kind of states, right? And then we store that in our user login state object, or however you want to name this. And if we have multiple reducers, like other reducer, and then we can just define reducer or state 2 other reducer, and then state 3 other reducers, and so on. Okay, this is where you combine different reducers and different states. Okay, save that there. Back in the home screen, I want to do destructuring of the user login state. And here we can extract the user info, because user login is basically, this entire thing would be user login. And then from the user login, we can extract .user info, because this entire thing is our state object, and this is what's inside this object, as we defined here. And that might take a while to take in, but we can basically do destructuring here. And then we just want to create this variable first name. Depending on whether we have the user info or not, we can extract the first name or just keep it null. Save that. So by now we pretty much have everything we need for different pages, reducer, action, and store in place. But we still do have some errors that we have to fix, and I would say that's the gist of this entire tutorial, because that's the hard part. We want to incorporate Typescript properly to be able to catch errors and fix them to have them working properly. So let's do npm run start and see what kind of errors we get. And meanwhile, I also want to run our backend. Okay, once this refreshes, it's gonna throw some errors, and let's see what we have. So the first error that we come across is saying that the reducer for key user login returned undefined during initialization. So the first thing we have to make sure is that the backend is running. And also one thing we forgot to add in our user reducer is the initial state of our state when the reducer is called for the first time. So here, because everything else, like the loading and the error, is optional, we don't have to define that here. But because user info is not optional, you want to say user info, the initial state will be an empty object like that. So once we save that, it's now going to work. And let me close this real quick to just show you how we can have Redux DevTools here. And if you don't have this installed, I'm pretty sure you can just type Redux DevTools Chrome, and then it's gonna show you how you can install the extension. Pretty simple. Okay, when we come here, you realize how this thing has changed, but we don't see anything here. I don't know what's going on here. I'll log out, log in, and let's see what happens. So right now our state user login has an empty user info. Now when we log in, we are gonna be redirected to the new page and things are loading as we wanted. But now our navbar, we want to display a logout here in order for the user to be able to log out. So we're going to implement that for our header, which is our navbar. And we also want to get rid of this 500 errors, which is happening because inside our app.tsx, we are fetching data from the user on every reload. So we actually don't need this at all. Same for the first name. We don't need anything in the app.tsx. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of this and change this to home screen like that. No, my bad, like home screen like that. Inside the header, get rid of that. And I'm getting an error because in our component header, we still have this parameters defined. So get rid of that, get rid of this interface props. And we are not going to be fetching data from our logout page or the navbar page. So again, come back to user action. And underneath here, I want to define a logout function, const logout, like that. So pretty much the same format as above. And I'm going to copy what we had before for type checking. Okay, here, I'm gonna paste this here. Same for dispatch. Define this here. And this is gonna return a promise of type void. Okay, we have the type checking in place. In here, I'm going to dispatch type would be user logout. And this is where we want to do the fetch on this API/logout, which we created in part 1 of this tutorial. So save that there. And inside the logout handler, instead of setting the first name and fetching data like that, I am simply going to call dispatch logout function like that. And in order to use dispatch, we have to import use dispatch from React Redux. So const dispatch use dispatch like that. And in our previous example, we checked if first name variable existed and then displayed the logout or the login respectively. But instead of having the first name, I'm going to use the use selector hook from React Redux. So here I can do user login. So we've done this before. Selector, we're going to receive a root state and return the user state, where we receive the state of type root state and return the state user login, and then do a simple destructuring from user login. And here I'm going to check if user info exists, and then if it does, we can display logout. If not, we are going to allow the user to log in or sign up. Alright, so if we refresh, okay, it's not reading, it's not updated. So we have to save this page and refresh. Okay, and everything seems to be in place, but still some changes that we have to implement. So whenever you refresh, it displays logout. And let's see what's going on here. We are displaying the page name and everything, but whenever we refresh, it kind of goes back. That's because our states are not maintained, or upon refreshing it disappears. So what we can do is actually store our user information in our local storage, but we can set that up in our user action. And it's very simple. So what we can do is inside the try catch statement at the end, once the user login has been successful, we can do local storage dot set item user info, and then pass in the string format of our user data, right? User data. And when we log out, we want to remove that item, storage, local storage, that remove item, that user info. And then where are we gonna link this local storage together in the states? We can do that and set this value as our initial state in the store. So in our store, I want to create this user info from storage variable, where we get item from local storage user info. And if we can get something, I'm going to parse this data by doing the get item. If not, I'm gonna return undefined. Now I have to add an exclamation mark here, because if not, it's gonna throw an error saying that this is not assignable to type parameter of type string. So by passing in the exclamation mark, we're saying this is not undefined. And we have the info from the storage, and that's what we are going to set for the initial state of our user login. Okay, so user info is going to come from user info from storage, like this. Okay, and it's going to throw another error saying this user info of type any is not assignable to type user login undefined. So I did have to do some Google search on that, and that is because all reducers are passed undefined on initialization. And in order to go about this, after initial state, we have to define this as an empty object like that. Okay, once we are done with that, we can come back here and okay, that seems to be working. So we're logged in right now as David. When we log out, okay, now we don't have the information in the user info state. Again, when we try to log in, now it displays our name properly. But as you might have seen, you kind of realize how it redirects us to the home page and then refreshes our name. Okay, that's the last fix that we are going to add to this tutorial. And this is something I mentioned briefly when we were working on the login screen. This is something we have to add here. So using use effect and the use selector hook that we haven't used after defining. So let's actually first call our user login from our store using use selector hook. So as usual, you're gonna define our types. Okay, state will be type root state. And then we can extract the user login from here and then do this structuring like this. Save it. And then we also want to define a use effect hook. And I'll explain once I type everything out. And this is gonna reload on every change with the user info and history. So let me actually pass this history.push inside the use effect. And history.push basically redirects the page for us. But then inside the use effect, we're gonna check if user info first name exists. But because this the type of first name is undefined, we're gonna check if this is not undefined. Actually, and then only when it's not undefined, then we're gonna check if user info that first name exists. And then if it does, we're gonna redirect the user. Okay, this is a small tweak that we have to add to our application so that when the user logs out, okay, and tries to log in again, only when you see that slight delay there in the login screen. So we are checking if we successfully retrieve the user information from the backend, and only then we are redirecting the user to the home screen. And that was quite a long tutorial, but that's pretty much it for implementing Redux in our application along with TypeScript. I hope everything made sense. You can always refer back to this diagram if anything doesn't make sense. And thank you all for watching. I'm going to come back later with more tutorials. Thank you.